You're listening to the ATS Breathe Easy podcast, brought to you by the American Thoracic Society.
Welcome to the ATS Breathe Easy podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Erika Moseson, a pulmonary and critical care medicine physician in Oregon and host of the Air Health, Our Health podcast. Today, we are bringing you part 2 of our series on the decision by the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States to set the value of a statistical life at 0 and to not consider healthcare costs in economic analysis of the impact of air pollution regulation. I am continuing our discussion today with Dr. Anthony Gerber, who is a renowned COPD researcher who spent nearly a decade working as a member of the Colorado Air Quality Control Commission and is intimately familiar with the clinical, regulatory, and public health challenges of regulating air pollution. On our last episode, we covered this decision by the EPA and the complex trade-offs between the positive health impacts of regulations to control emissions and how to balance them with potentially negative impacts on industries on which we all rely, from transportation to energy generation. So if you had to explain to a non-expert, why removing this calculation isn't just kind of an accounting change or something technical or wonky, but an actual threat to public health, what would you say?
Yeah, and so I think that let's just go to, to kind of let's just make up an example so people can understand. Okay, so suppose you've got a factory and it creates pollutants, and there's a filter system that costs $1,000 and it eliminates 20% of the pollutants. There's a filter system that costs $10,000 and it eliminates 80% of the pollutants. And there's a filter system that costs $10 million and it gets rid of 90%. There's probably one of those solutions that makes the most sense. Now, if those pollutants it depends on the cost that is being borne by the people who are impacted by the pollution. If that pollution is, killing thousands and thousands of people, and again, I use the asbestos example, but there are other air toxics, you're going to say, look, that 90% makes sense. This is so deadly and so toxic that even though it's expensive, it works. The pollution is only modestly toxic. Maybe it's that middle one that makes sense. So you're getting 80% and it's a reasonable cost. And so that's sort of the way you have to use those numbers. Otherwise, you're just sort of shooting in the dark. And you go, well, 60% of the pollutant sounds good to me. And that seems, and it costs this amount of money. You're just sort of making it up. And so you really need, it's like a seesaw. If you don't have some idea of what the weight is on the other side, you can't possibly get the weight correct on the regulation side. And that's why it's just so important. And again, it's not perfect. It's imprecise, but you need to do your best. Otherwise it's unbalanced. Like a seesaw, it just has all the weight on one side.
Yeah. Zooming out, it just seems odd that an agency can just upend 50 years of precedent. Is this decision likely to stand, or is it likely to be overturned or challenged? And, if it does stand, what does this regulatory landscape in the United States look like over the next decade?
There's some nuance to it, and I don't claim to. So these are coming at the EPA, kind of at the federal level. So when they're passing a federal law, they're not going to, a federal regulation, they're not going to try and consider that cost. Now, I assume that this is a interpretation of the Clean Air Act. They're not rewriting the Clean Air Act. And so I think that different administrations could look at it differently. So I'm not certain that this would be durable because it's not written into the law, right? These are interpretations that one administration has and another administration might have it differently. It also certainly doesn't preclude local, state, and regional groups from trying to do that kind of consideration in their rulemaking. So I'm not sure what it does for rulemaking around particular federally mandated statutes that are going to be implemented at the local level. But for example, Colorado 10 or 15 years ago put in rules to try and regulate pollutants from fracking. And they did that. That was not related to EPA regulations. That was driven locally. And they considered the costs and the benefits. And so that kind of cost benefit is not going to be precluded by this. And looking into the future, whether or not a different administration could reinterpret, I think is an open question. Now, to get back though, I think to the bigger issue, I do think that industry has felt that the voices and the microphone and kind of the megaphone of the impacted community may have drowned out their economic concerns, right? So, and again, that example I gave you with the concrete plant, which is a bad example because concrete gets special regulations because it's known to be important. But it's an example of how you can have these cascading effects where hitting an industry might really disrupt the local economy. And they have felt that those things aren't accounted for. So if I was looking for a better path forward, I would want to make sure that we are working on both ends and trying to do it in an unbiased manner. We're really trying to calculate the benefit in health. Obviously, it's intangible, and doing our best to have the modeling account for the real cost. And again, there are thresholds, right? We need concrete. We can't put concrete out of business. You can't build. And so just making sure that we have that balance. And what I look at from this is that, yeah, I mean, maybe there's a short-term pause, but in general, we should all think about how did we get here? How did we get to a place where we weren't going to consider that health impact cost? And what can we do in the future to build systems where kind of both sides recognize the importance of considering the cost to industry and considering the benefit to health in a way that makes sense, and that we keep working on that methodology together to come up with solutions that work? Because, by the way, local communities also don't want regulations that put out their critical businesses. We can't live without some of these things. So I see both sides of the picture, and I think we just have to be mindful moving forward to make sure that we are trying to balance as carefully as we can. So, but just getting rid of the data, like let's sweep it under the rug and pretend it isn't there, that is not a durable solution either. It creates podcasts where we all are sitting here going, how can you not consider the cost?
Yeah. And I think, for those of us in clinical medicine, obviously we think of our patients, and I instantly thought of, how else might this affect those of us in the ATS community? Obviously we use the government to weigh cost of saving lives in healthcare, job safety, occupational medicine, drug and device safety, and more. Is this limited to the EPA as far as we know, or are we zeroing out everyone's life?
No. So, I think that let's be clear that this is not a broad upending of the way that people do cost benefit analysis. And to give you an interesting example, we're seeing a lot of locally polluting data centers get put into different places, right? And, if you're a local leader, it brings jobs, there are benefits, but, as you start to have diesel generators and other things creating electricity, there's going to be a cost, and people are going to get upset. And so, as people, as that industry matures and people start to, hey, I don't want to live near a data center unless it's better regulated, you will start to see people look at the cost and the benefit of, and that's really been the history of regulation of industry. And, people regulate because the cost becomes unbearable to people living there, be it from noise or dirty air. And the whole field grew up around trying to put a number value to what that kind of perceived cost is. So there's lots of places where we can still do that, local regulation, state regulation, and I'm sure there are other categories of the federal government. But I think we do have to, again, recognize that this was an assault on that attempt to balance, recognizing that there is nothing perfect about how we measure the numbers, but that does not mean we shouldn't try. And that I think that I've tried to express that I have some sympathy to industry, but just pretending that there aren't costs on the other, that's not a durable answer, and we need to do better than that.
Absolutely.
I'm excited to introduce a new benefit. ATS Now is a multimedia platform that's AI-driven and allows you to search ATS content for what you need to learn about and know more, whether it's ATS conference material or webinars, etc. It's really tailored to your needs and when you need them. It's like Netflix for pulmonologists. All ATS 2026 registrants will receive a free 1-year subscription for ATS Now.
And in its statement, the EPA, it is reported that the EPA stated it is actually very hard to find this statement directly from the EPA now, that not monetizing does not mean that they are not considering or valuing human life, but how they're planning to do that is, the data on that seems very limited. And do we have any indication about what that mean in practice, if, the health benefits to improving the environment are just kind of in theory acknowledged, but excluded in economic analysis?
So I think you hit the nail on the head. So the reason why the value-based system was developed was to at least create imperfect, but some kind of a framework for whether a regulation makes economic sense. Now, I would say, look, if you're going to consider the value of a human life, it's priceless. And so now, so it creates a slippery slope where how can, then the statute, again, the Clean Air Act is derived around benefit to human health. And so they cannot avoid considering it, right? That's the law. But the effort to put a number to it has actually been to make the regulations reasonable. Because again, if you don't try to
if it's my kid, you can't do any pollution, but if it's your kid, you can pollute a little bit.
Exactly.
As long as I like your kid.
If you don't try to put a number on it, then it just makes it even harder to come up with what the right, with whether a regulation is too expensive or is cost effective. And so that's the problem, is that, again, I think we started the discussion with this. If you don't have that number on that side and you just say, yeah, we value human life, what's we value it for? Is it $100? Is it $1,000? I mean, how, or do we say we value human life, but we sure value our economic productivity much more than it? So it's sort of, that's the concern, is that you don't have any way, is the public who is impacted by this, to understand how the EPA is valuing our lives. And so I think that's the real problem here, is that they can say they're valuing it, but we don't know if is it $1,000? Is it $100? We don't know what that number is. And that, to me, and again, it's an imprecise number, but we should at least do something with it.
It should be more than zero.
It should be more than zero. And I'm a believer, the more data you have, the better. And I just wanted to kind of comment, we had a lot of, and this is a tangential, we had a lot of dissatisfaction with sort of the net impact of COVID regulations, right? And what people said is we didn't have the data and we adopted a certain course. And maybe in hindsight, some of those regulations with schools were harmful. And so the message there was, don't do things without data. Here we have another health-related impact, and we're saying, let's do it without data. And so I don't like inconsistency. And I have a lot of sympathy for the argument that we made some decisions during COVID that in hindsight, we didn't have the data to know whether they were net benefit or net harmful. Here we have a system that is trying to come up with that. And rather than trying to refine the science, we're saying, let's just not do it. And so I don't like that inconsistency. And I think it's instructive to consider that, how we're considering, in one area, you didn't have the data. Here, let's just not even look at the data. I think we need better consistency across our kind of how we look at health.
Absolutely. In this case, we have over 50 years of data.
We have a lot of data, and it's a well-developed field, and to pretend that work hasn't been done doesn't serve anyone well.
Yeah. Are there any historical parallels with this action that come to mind? You mentioned COVID, and that's one I'm going to think about for a while, because it's true. We were acting with the idea that, almost in what you were mentioning, every life is, immeasurably valuable. And, people felt the burden of that more than I think we were appreciating at the time. Any other historic parallels?
I think that I would probably, and I'm not necessarily saying health related, but I would go to the insurance industry for historical parallels. So, there are homes in areas which people won't insure. Right? They just won't do it because the perceived risk, there's a perception that you lose money on that. And so they'll they'll put a value on your house, and they'll kind of put a risk around you. For example, you can't build houses in fire-prone areas where the firehouse and the system to put out the fire is more than a certain number of miles away. So they do a lot of actuarial science around, we would be bringing in this amount of money insurance, but it wouldn't pay the bill. So there are just so many examples of where we're able to come up with those balances. And I'm almost hard pressed to think of something on the other end where you just say, let's not even try. Really most of our economy in modern society, works on that principle. It's not uniform, right? I mean, there are probably things that we do where the perception of risk is much bigger than the risk, but the perception drives it. So example, airlines are really safe, but we have a whole system to keep them safe because people just are horrified by the idea of an airline crash. So it isn't always apples to apples, but I have a hard time thinking of something where we just don't even think about it. Like we don't even have we're just going to say it just doesn't matter. Let's not look at the data. It would be like taking cars and saying, let's just get rid of crash tests. Like, let's just pretend that they're perfectly safe and that the technology is good enough. So you shouldn't have that data in front of you. So there are so many examples in society where we try and make those cost benefit analyses, and why we are singling out health effects here and those indirect costs to not try and do this analysis. I'm having a hard time thinking of a lot of areas where we do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there something you wish people understood about this issue that you don't think is being captured in the news or what we've already covered?
Yeah, and I think that again, I don't want to vilify industry. We all use the products of industry. They're useful. And there are times when I have seen regulations that people have tried to promulgate that just don't make sense. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. They're too expensive. And so I think it is fair to say, yeah, the regulated community, they have a voice and a stake, and they're important. And so, I don't want people to perceive that. And I think a lot of the media comes across as saying, how can they not be looking at the cost of this? So I want to be very clear. We need to look at both sets of costs. There is a cost to the regulation, but we also have to look at the benefit. And I think that mixture we need to get right. And I think that both communities, the regulated community and the health impacted community, need to work together to try and get those numbers right, not just sort of cut off the one side of it. Doesn't make any sense. So.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things is, there always tends to be this bifurcation that the regulated community is separate from the impacted community, but we're actually all one community, right? We all need this industry in our communities. We are all impacted by these health effects. And so I think that also just kind of helps us remember that this is all one and the same.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I will go back to the Colorado situation where the rulemaking, the regulated community and the health impacted community and the regulators, it was a community. It was the same people showing up to the same meetings, trying to come up with consensus. And as you got to know the people on both sides, there were no villains in the attorneys representing, for example, wastewater treatment plants, when there was concern about hydrogen sulfide pollution from them. That's a byproduct of sulfide. It's a product of human waste. And so there were no villains. There was just trying to come up with best solutions, recognizing that, wastewater is part of being human. We generate that. It generates pollutants. And how can we think through this? So there are no villains. It's one community. And the answer is to work better as a community, as a whole community, rather than trying to polarize and turn this into a little bit of kind of a false dichotomy of regulated and impacted, and realize that there's a lot of intersection. You might be in the impacted community and have a job that is directly impacted by the regulation, or vice versa. So really important to realize that we're all in this together, and that when you try and create an arbitrary schism, that in the long run is not going to lead to the most optimal solutions. At least I think cooperation and collaboration is the way to get there, not trying to put a line in the sand and stop people talking.
Absolutely. Well, in case it's not clear, the American Thoracic Society opposes these changes by the EPA. And you and I both serve on the Environmental Health Policy Committee. And I understand that multiple members of our committee actually have an article in review for one of our ATS journals to try to help clarify the ATS position on that. And is that correct?
It is, and I think again, this is not. I don't think this is super controversial. This is not trying to go out on a limb of we need to get rid of all industry so we can all return to quiet agrarian lifestyles. This is pragmatic.
I don't want that.
It let's look at the costs on both sides, and that we don't feel that limiting the dialogue is a way to get to consensus or durable solutions. And obviously, when you have patients who are, I couldn't go to work today, I can't go take care of my grandkid today because they want to play outside and it's too polluted, I can't buy my inhaler. We see those real costs, and they have to be considered. And again, we have tools to consider them. It's not. And so I think that there's a pretty good group of scientists, and it's a science-oriented community in ATS. And I think there's a belief that the more analysis you do, the better solution you will get. And I think that's one of the messages from the piece that we're putting together. And I think in the ATS in general, we like to talk to people. If we are happy to communicate why it's important, and why considering the health impacts isn't at odds with having industry. It's designed to get it to work together and to create durable, sustainable solutions that will be in place 5, 10, 20 years from now, as opposed to changing every time we get a swing in the political climate.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for your time and for your science and service for cleaner air. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, that's it. Thank you for having me. And it was, you're a great podcast host.
Well, looking forward to seeing you at ATS.
Equally. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us today. To learn more, visit our website at thoracic.org. Find more ATS Breathe Easy podcasts on Transistor, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss a show.